Okay, in this video we're going to focus on Moshe's speech impediment, what he's called kvar peh ukvar lashon. This appears in Perek Daled, and let's open it up inside over here. Perek Daled pasuk yod. So Moshe says over here that in his kvar peh ukvar lashon, he can't go before Paro because he's not a man of words, and he uses this ambiguous phrase kvar peh ukvar lashon. So what does that mean? Rashbam tells us it means any bakibul lashon Mitzrayim bechituch lashon, that I'm not an expert in the Egyptian language and how to pronounce words in it. Why not? I mean, after all, didn't Moshe grow up in Egypt? Explains Rashbam, ki bekatnuti barachti misham. In my youth, I ran away from there. Va'ata ani keven shmonim, and now I'm about 80 years old. So it's true that Egyptian may have been his native language, but as we discussed, he's been away from Egypt for around 60 years. And so in all that time, he hasn't spoken in Egyptian to anyone. Now he's worried he's not going to be able to speak well in the Egyptian language when he has to appear before Paro. Now, we're going to skip his parallel that he cites from Yechezkel over here and skip to the end here. Rashbam is not only advocating for the idea that Moshe had an accent in Egyptian, but he's also opposed to the idea that he had an overall speech defect. Says Rashbam, V'chi efshar Navi asher yida'u Hashem panim al panim v'kibel Torah miyado liyado haya megamgem b'lshono. Is it possible, could it be that a Navi whom Hashem knew face to face, which is an expression used for how God speaks to Moshe, and that he got the Torah from him, that man haya megamgem b'lshono, he kind of stuttered or stumbled with his speech? Rashbam argues it can't be that Moshe had a defect, because it can't be that the greatest Navi ever, the Navi who got the Torah and who spoke to God the way we speak to our peers, it can't be that that Navi had a speech defect. And you might say, wait a minute, but I heard a story when I was a kid about Moshe burning his tongue on some hot coals. Says Rashbam, I don't want to hear about this stuff about a speech defect. Such a tradition does not appear in Tanaim v'Amoraim. Right? We would think there's a midrash about that. Rashbam is saying it's not a real midrash. You shouldn't be concerned with external works that are not really part of Chazal and their traditions. Now, what's Rashbam so upset about over here? So, if you look back to Rashi did say that Moshe had difficulty speaking, but Rashi didn't elaborate beyond that. Rashi didn't tell any stories about how Moshe would have gotten a speech defect. And Rashbam seems to be talking about some sort of foreign text, right? What he calls Sfarim Chitzonim. So I mentioned there is this source called the Chronicles of Moses, or in Hebrew, Divrei Hayamim Moshe Rabbeinu, and we don't know so much about it. According to an academic who wrote about this, and he concluded that it was written in the early Middle Ages, in the Mea Asirito Achadesrei, the 10th or 11th century, at 900 to 1000, so a little bit before the time of Rashi, but we don't know much more than that about this work. So there is this Hebrew work, you can take a look at it here, they have it on Sefaria. It says something about how, 130 years after we went down to Egypt, 60 years after Yosef died, Paro had a dream, blah, blah, blah. So it can tell this whole story about the birth of Moshe. In the middle of this midrash, it says something about the Paro commanded, and they brought a jewel, a gem, before him, and a hot coal. If Moshe knows to go for the jewel, then we're going to know that he understands what he's doing, and we're going to judge him harshly. That when baby Moshe tried to grab Paro's crown, it means he wanted to rebel. But if he goes for the coal, then we'll know he's a baby and doesn't know what he's doing. So they do this test, and what happens, of course? Moshe reaches for the valuable stone, the gem, which would get him killed. So some angel comes and pushes Moshe's hand away from the hot coal, away from the gem and towards the hot coal. Na'asa kvad peh uchvad lashon. And so this thing, it touched his lips, the coal touched his lips, and with the edge of his tongue, and from that he became kvad peh uchvad lashon, and through that he was saved. So this midrash, which again it's quoted in Svaria, we all think of it as a midrash. It has this whole story about how Moshe burned his tongue. It does appear later in Shmot Rabbah as well, which he mentioned is edited very late, and Rashbam might not have seen. Rashbam is by saying En lachush t'sfrim achitzonim. Rashbam is saying I don't accept that source, Divrei Hayamim of Moshe, Chronicles of Moses, which would have been written not more than 200 years before him, in a century or two before him. I don't accept that as a legitimate source, and so I think we don't have any authentic tradition for Moshe having a speech defect. Instead, he had an Egyptian accent. Now, we contrasted Rashbam's view here with something that we cut and pasted from the Dreshos Haran. And we notice that the Dreshos Haran disagrees on two fronts. According to Rashbam, first of all, in terms of the facts, what is Kvad Peh Uchvad Lashon? An Egyptian accent, right? Moreover, Rashbam rejected the idea of it being a speech defect on ideological grounds, right? He thought it was impossible to believe that the greatest Navi, the one who gave us the Torah, would have been unclear in his speech. I mean, imagine that ceremony. Moshe comes down from Har Sinai. Everyone wants to know what Hashem said, and Moshe just says some sort of mumbling. He can't speak clearly. How could that be? Wouldn't that kill the moment? And the Ran disagrees factually, first of all. The Ran disagrees about the speech defect, and he says that Moshe was lacking hadibur hatzach. He was lacking smooth, pure speech. So according to the Ran stands for Rabbeinu Nisim, according to Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona, who lived about 200 years after Rashbam, Moshe was not able to speak clearly. He had a general problem speaking clearly, what we today call a speech defect. Not only does he disagree about that fact, that he thinks Moshe had a speech defect, and Rashbam thinks Moshe did not have a speech defect, but the Ran also argues on the principle of it. Rashbam had said Moshe didn't have a speech defect, because how could the guy who gave us the Torah have a speech defect? And the Ran says no, not only Moshe did have a speech defect, but God wanted the guy who'll give us the Torah to have a speech defect. Moshe's pure speech was removed from him through hashkacha, through divine providence, meaning Hashem wanted it to be that way. It shouldn't be that the fact that Bnei Israel were led after Moshe is because of his pure speech, right? If Moshe spoke clearly, then you might say, you know what, God didn't really give him the Torah, or the stuff that Moshe told them Hashem gave him, he wasn't really telling the truth. And they believed him because he was such a smooth talker and a con man, he conned them into believing something false. Like we sometimes say picture the idea in English of a charlatan. Sometimes we'll say that about somebody who is very smooth in the way that he talks, that he can lead the hearts of the masses after him, right? Sometimes you have someone who basically is a phony guy. He doesn't have any real content to what he's saying, any real substance, but he'll be like a demagogue. He'll get up and speak in front of large crowds, and he's such a charismatic speaker, so fiery, so slick in the way that he speaks, that people will follow him, even though he's leading them in a bad direction. And so if Moshe were blessed, as Rashbam had said, right, if Moshe were blessed with smooth, crisp, pure speech and charisma and all that, then maybe we'd have to look back and say, maybe the Torah is not true. Maybe they only believed it back then because Moshe conned them into it. So it says the Ram, the Zoda Siba, for that reason, Haya Kvad Peh Uchvad Lashon Bashkacha Gemura. Therefore, Moshe was Kvad Peh Uchvad Lashon through divine providence. According to the Ram, Kvad Peh Uchvad Lashon means a speech impediment, and the Ram further raises this issue of why God Dafka wanted Moshe to be that way, and says the Ran, God wanted Moshe to be that way so that he would not be able to smooth talk anyone into believing something that's not true. So, in sum, we saw between Rashbam and the Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim, two opposite approaches. Rashbam thinks it would be bad for a Navi to have a speech impediment, especially the greatest Navi ever, and so it's important, if Moshe is going to be the one who's God's spokesman and giving us the Torah, that he speak purely and crisply, and so Moshe apparently could do that in Hebrew. The only problem was he couldn't do it in Egyptian. And the Ran, on the other hand, thinks Moshe could not do that in any language because he had a general speech defect, but the Ran thinks that's a good thing. The fact that Moshe's speech was impaired means people had to accept the Torah because of the compelling truth of the Torah, and not because the man who presented it to us smooth-talked us or conned us into believing something not true. Let's look now at Ibn Ezra's approach. I'm deliberately going to begin by reading out of Ibn Ezra's short commentary. And in his short commentary, says Ibn Ezra, what does it mean? Kvad per kvad lashon, it can actually mean both. Kvad per b'toladat, Moshe had difficult speech, that's his nature, meaning what we call speech defect. He was made to have difficulty speaking. And kvad lashon, difficulty, lashon can mean a tongue or it can mean language, so that means the shon Mitzrayim, the language of Egypt. He hadn't spoken Egyptian in many years. So Ibn Ezra, the second part about Kvad Lashon, sounds a lot like what Rashbam had said. I'm going to argue later that Ibn Ezra, at this point, in his short commentary, probably was not familiar with it from Rashbam, but he himself was aware of this possibility that Moshe has difficulty speaking Egyptian. But note this first part, that he also says Kvad Per B'Toledet. He also had a speech impediment. So to say that Moshe had both, that he had a general speech defect from birth, and on top of that he had an accent, that sounds at first like it's 50% like Rashbam, but the truth is it's very different. Because when Rashbam said Moshe had an accent in Egyptian, Rashbam further emphasized that it's impossible for the Navi to hesitate with his speech. It's impossible for the greatest Navi ever to have a speech defect. So when Ibn Ezra now comes and says, Moshe had a speech defect that he was born with, and an accent, he's not really agreeing with Rashbam 50% of the way. Because even though they both agree Moshe had an accent, the fact that Ibn Ezra also thinks that Moshe had a speech defect means he fundamentally disagrees with the notion that the greatest Navi ever has to have smooth, crisp speech. And so on Rashbam's fundamental point, that all Moshe could possibly have is an accent, because there's no way that the greatest Navi ever could have a speech impediment, Ibn Ezra thinks that fundamental point is wrong. And Ibn Ezra lived well before Rabbeinu Nissim. Rabbeinu Nissim might have seen inspiration in Ibn Ezra's writings for this idea that Moshe had a speech defect, and it's okay for the greatest Navi ever to have a speech defect. As we turn to Ibn Ezra's long commentary, we see him being a bit more forceful with this. He says very clearly over here, whoever would say that Moshe forgot Egyptian, that his whole issue was an Egyptian accent, that's not true. Why? Because there are two issues, Kvad Peh and Kvad Lashon. Again, he's open to the idea that Kvad Lashon might be an accent, but that can't be the main issue here. Ibn Ezra brings proof over here, which he didn't bring in the short commentary. He says, I'll prove that to you, because God says, Misam Pele Adam, Omi Asum Ileim, etc. God's response to Moshe in the next pasuk is, who creates speech? Who gives man a mouth? Who makes some people mute, incapable of speaking? It's me, Hashem. And so, by God saying that back to Moshe, God seems to be addressing the concern of a speech defect. Moshe says, I'm Kvad Peh. God says, well, who created your mouth? So obviously God's saying, I created you that way. And so if the whole issue is that Moshe hasn't spoken Egyptian in 60 years, God didn't create him with an Egyptian accent. When Moshe was a kid, he was a native speaker of Egyptian. But, says Ibn Ezra, if Kvad Peh, at least that part of the phrase, means actual speech defect, then God brings up the Peh again in his response and says, Misam Pele Adam, who made a mouth? I made your mouth that way. And that's why God says later, Anochi impicha, I'll be with your mouth, I'll guide you. Here Ibn Ezra says something a little bit wild. What does it mean that I'll guide you? I'll guide you to speak words that are not hard for you to pronounce. According to Ibn Ezra, God's solution was that Moshe had a speech defect, but Moshe won't have to say words that are particularly hard for him to pronounce. We observed here that it seems like Ibn Ezra, between his short commentary and his long commentary, became familiar with Rashbam's writing, because in his short commentary he's very matter-of-fact. He says Kvad Peh and Kvad Lashon are a natural speech defect and an accent. Then in his long commentary he gets all worked up. Ha'omer, how could somebody say Moshe forgot Egyptian? And so it seems like at that point